Are you curious about how much divorce attorneys charge? In this video, we'll break down everything that goes into what you pay a divorce lawyer. We'll go into what determines how much legal fees are, how much you pay, things like what's in a retainer agreement, the common hidden costs in divorce, and whether you or your spouse might have to pay for the other's attorney's fees. So let's get at it. So what are the factors that go into how much an attorney charges? The total legal fees are going to depend on a couple of different factors, including the hourly rate for the attorney, the complexity of the case, and sometimes other things like geographic factors. So how does the attorney's experience level relate to the amount they charge? This one's pretty simple most of the time. Typically, the more experienced and senior an attorney is, the higher their hourly rate. As an example, an entry-level attorney just joining a law firm practicing family law is probably going to have an hourly rate here in South Florida of about $250 an hour, whereas a more experienced attorney such as myself, I'm board certified, I started at the law firm, my hourly rate's $600 an hour. And then there's attorneys around my area that have been doing this for several decades longer than I have. They represent the celebrities. Their hourly rates are in the $700 to even above range. The attorney's hourly rate should take into account the fact that they can do things quicker after doing it longer. They're going to know answers off the top of their head instead of having to take time to research items. Also, the more senior, higher billing attorneys are typically only going to do the case-critical tasks. As an example, me in my practice, I'm typically involved in setting an initial case strategy, monitoring the progress, and really for the most part coming in and doing the trials or key parts of a trial. Everything else is usually going to be done by a lower price but very capable attorney. Moral of the story here, don't get completely scared off by an attorney's hourly rate, especially if they are part of a firm that has several different attorneys that can work on your case at lower price points. So do divorce attorneys' fees vary by geography? Typically they do. My practice is here in Palm Beach County, Florida, one of the more affluent areas in the country, so the hourly rates of lawyers here tend to be higher than lawyers in even other parts of Florida. Typically in the Florida market, we see the prices charged in cities like Orlando or Tampa, more secondary markets, sometimes being even 25% lower than what we see as commonplace here in South Florida. Then it definitely varies by state. Typically, a divorce lawyer in Midtown Manhattan in one of those very tall buildings that's on the postcard of the New York City skyline is going to have a much higher hourly rate than an attorney in Florida would, and that attorney in Florida is going to have typically a higher hourly rate than, an attorney in the middle of Oklahoma would. So there will be some geographic variance in the hourly rates you should expect to pay for an attorney in your divorce. So what's the biggest predictor of legal fees in a divorce? The complexity of the case. The more complex the case, the more work involved, the more animosity between the people getting divorced, you guessed it, the higher the legal fees. So what is the average cost of a divorce? A good rule of thumb is you should expect to spend between 1 to 3% of the total assets in your marriage on your divorce lawyer. And your divorce is probably going to cost at a minimum about $5,000, regardless of these percentages. So just as an example, if you have $500,000 and you're getting divorced, a general rule of thumb should be that you're going to spend between that 1 and 3%. That's somewhere between $5,000 to $15,000 to get divorced. This assumes that there's not an instant boom agreement with your spouse, there's a little bit of negotiating, and at the lower ranges of assets pretty much excludes a cost of a full-blown trial. But these are just rules of thumb and what you should probably expect. I've heard that the average divorce in the United States costs each person about $20,000. That can be a little higher, a little low, depending on the assets, but hopefully this gives you a decent range. So how much does an uncontested divorce cost? Here in South Florida, you're going to see these uncontested divorces, which are the divorces to where you and your spouse have agreed to everything. Nobody's fighting over what the settlement agreement says. There's a true meeting of the minds as to the terms of the settlement, and the lawyer just writes everything up into a contract that both people sign. That's an uncontested divorce. Where I'm at in South Florida, we see the range of those types of divorces typically range between $2,500 to $10,000. The range depends on how many assets need to be divided. Are we selling real estate? Are there children? What is the level of financial disclosure that's necessary if there are kids to satisfy the judge? Things like that. Bottom line though, if it's truly uncontested, it's truly going to be much cheaper than many of the other divorce scenarios. So how much is divorce going to cost if you use a mediator? We get asked this question a lot. People hear that, oh, if I do my divorce through a mediator, it's going to cost a lot less money. So is that true? Sometimes it is, but you usually get what you pay for. If you're just going to a non-lawyer who's a mediator who makes a non-legally binding or legally fluent settlement agreement that you and your spouse sign, then yeah, it isn't going to cost that much money. You might see signs for those people on the sides of roads by intersections. Probably a good idea to stay away from that type of a divorce mediation, but it does cost less. If you truly don't have much to lose, yeah, you could go that route, but still be cautious. Plenty of those people will charge $500 to $1,000 to do a bare bones mediation using the state forms, and then they may even file the case for you. Oftentimes though, if you have any level of assets, mediation is going to be more involved than that. There's a misconception that mediation results in a cheap divorce. Well, if you have assets, if there's businesses, if there's children, and there isn't an instant agreement, a divorce settled through mediation can easily cost 1% to 3% of your assets, usually at least $10,000 if there's financial discovery beforehand. Also, it takes time to negotiate the terms back and forth, and sometimes settling divorce through mediation means multiple mediations, which means multiple days, and the costs keep going higher and higher. So if you go and you settle your divorce through mediation, it's probably going to be less than if you go all the way through a court hearing or a trial, but the costs of mediation still are going to be significant if there's a lot of back and forth between you and your spouse. So are contested divorces more expensive? I hear the term contested divorce a lot, and it means a lot of things to a lot of people. The definition of contested divorce that I use is a divorce that starts to where people don't immediately agree on how to divide everything and what their settlement is. But just because your divorce starts out contested doesn't mean it's going to be very expensive. The reason for that is most people who start out with a contested divorce usually end up solving their divorce, resolving everything through a divorce mediation that happens a few weeks or a few months into the divorce case, and they never actually even step inside of a courtroom. So with those types of contested divorces, the cost isn't going to be all that high. But if the divorce is contested, really contested, and has a lot of activity, has things like depositions, multiple court hearings, and a full-blown trial, well, yeah, that's going to cost a lot more money, because those types of cases involve 20 to 30 times the amount of time for a lawyer to prepare and do all the lawyer things that are involved to appropriately represent you in court. Thing to remember here though is, unless you're going to have the War of the Rosens, even if you don't have an agreement with your spouse at the very beginning and you have a contested divorce, the cost might not be all that high, because usually after a few months the tensions calm down, the lawyers get everybody to mediation, and there's a resolution with usually not even a court hearing happening. So how much does a divorce trial cost? Usually at a minimum, a divorce trial done right with a lawyer who's prepared well, if there are significant assets at stake, is usually going to cost at least $50,000 on the low end from the time of filing the case to getting to trial. And on the higher end, you could see several $100,000 up to $1 million of legal fees, depending on the exact issues in the case, the amount of days in trial, and the county where the case is tried in. Some counties in South Florida have all the days of trial back to back to back. In some counties like Miami, you might try a day of the trial in February, 3 days in March, 4 days in September, and guess what? The facts changes as time goes on, so there's even more expense. You usually end up paying more for a trial in those counties. So who pays for the divorce lawyer? We're talking about how much it costs. What if you don't have the money? Well, your spouse might be required to pay for your legal bills, or you might have to pay for your spouse's legal bills. Florida has an attorney fee and cost shifting law that's similar to a lot of other states. And in Florida, basically, if one spouse is going to leave the marriage with significantly higher income and a higher share of the assets, they very well might be required to pay for their spouse's lawyer. There's a lot of factors that go into this. Check out the description. There's a link to the attorney fee and cost page on our website that shows the most common scenarios and how they're typically dealt with in Florida. So attorney retainers and upfront legal costs. What should you expect? So how do retainers work in divorce cases? Typically, a retainer is an amount of money that you will pay upfront to the divorce lawyer that you hire. For most lawyers, this amount of money is going to go to their trust account, and the attorney is going to keep it and use it to pay the invoices that they issue to you. With my firm and most others, this money is not the firm's money, and if your case ends and there's still money left in the trust account, that money is going to be returned to you. Pro tip here though, watch out for attorneys who charge a non-refundable retainer. In most states, including Florida, it is perfectly legal for the attorney to take a certain amount of money up front and not have to refund that money to you, even if you reconcile with your spouse. Holding that money back is bad business, but it's allowable by the laws of Florida. So you're going to make sure you want to ask questions about that when you're interviewing lawyers. How much are these initial retainers? It will depend on the lawyer and the law firm. Some lawyers don't charge any money up front. There is no retainer. They just send you a bill. Those are usually inexperienced attorneys. Probably watch out if that's what you're being offered. In South Florida, it's pretty common for the initial retainer for an attorney to be between $5,000 and $20,000. At my firm, a lot of our retainers start in the $7,500 area for most of our partner attorneys. If you want to work specifically with me or with a more experienced lawyer at another law firm, those initial retainers are usually going to start around $15,000 and go on upwards. It's not out of this world to see those retainers around $30,000 if there's a very complex marital estate with a lot of anticipated litigation. So why do some lawyers charge higher retainers than others? That's a good question, because the cost of the attorney's retainer is not in any way usually representative of what your divorce is going to cost. The initial retainer is really just a down payment on what you're going to end up paying the lawyer in most cases. So some attorneys will try to charge a lower retainer to lure you in, get you in the door, and then you're going to get a bill that's going to exceed the retainer a couple weeks later. Other retainers are just more upfront about what it's going to cost to represent you in the divorce case. They'll usually charge a little bit of a higher retainer. And then for a lot of lawyers that have been at it a while, they're going to gauge the amount of the initial retainer payment based on how much activity is likely going to be happening in the early parts of your case. If you're hiring the lawyer in the middle of a hot mess of nasty divorce litigation, you're probably going to be hearing quotes of a higher initial retainer than if everything is amicable and you just need to do a quick settlement agreement with your spouse. So will you get back the unused retainer payment to your divorce lawyer? It depends on what the contract with the lawyer says. With a lot of lawyers, including my law firm, the unused amount of the retainer is going to be refunded to you at the end of the case. But for some lawyers, they have non-refundable retainer payments. Take a really good look at the fine print of the contract that the lawyer gives you. In my opinion, those non-refundable retainers are a little bit shady, but the lawyers are entitled to do them. And some justify it based on the fact that if you hire them and they have a pretty good reputation in the community, they can no longer represent your spouse. So they view it as the cost of securing them to do your divorce case. Because they can't represent your spouse, you have to pay a non-refundable fee to them, even if your divorce never really even ends up happening. Moral of the story here, read the fine print in the contract that you sign with the lawyer before you hire them. If there is no contract with the lawyer about how legal fees are going to work, you probably should be thinking twice about hiring that lawyer. So what are the common hidden costs involved with a divorce? Court filing fees. These are one of the hidden costs of divorce. You have to remember that you're going to be paying a case initiation fee. Usually it's around $400 to $500, depending on which county you're in, to just file the case. Also, when you file that court case, you're going to be paying a process server in most instances to serve your spouse with a divorce petition. With a lot of those servers, that's another $100 to $150 right there. So just filing the case and getting the case served usually going to pay somewhere between $600 to $700 just to do that. Expert witness fees. These are another hidden cost of divorce cases. Not every case involves the need for an expert witness, but when the need does arise, the cost does rise for your divorce. So what are these expert witnesses? They're people like forensic accountants, people like vocational evaluators, property appraisers. Some of these titles, you're hearing it and you're probably thinking, what the heck does that person even do? Well, they take your money if they're needed in a divorce case. How much do they cost? Property appraisers are usually going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 to $2,000, depending on the type of property. A vocational evaluator, these are people that determine how much income you can make based on your job credentials and your local community and the jobs available in your local community. They usually cost somewhere between $3,000 to $10,000, depending on if they have to go to trial. Forensic accountants, the cost of these professionals, which are probably the most common, are usually going to be in the range of $7,500 to $25,000. The range will be dependent on, is there a need to do an alimony analysis? Is there a business to value? How organized are the records? Things like that. I've seen it cost a little bit less. I've certainly seen people pay more in very complicated cases. So these are some of the costs that you might have to pay if you're getting divorced and you need to bring in one of these experts. So what are the best ways to limit your attorney's fees in your divorce? Tip number one here is to be as organized as possible before the divorce, but also in dealing with your attorney. Check out a link in the description. We've got a guide to getting organized for divorce. This can help you do some of the work that the attorney would have to do so that when you hire the lawyer, you have a nice package you can put together that summarizes the assets, the debts, your income, your expenses, all the things they're going to need to find out from you during the divorce case. If you have that organized up front and you have your financial statements together in an organized fashion, which the book will walk you through, you're going to spend less money on your legal fees. Tip number two is to learn about the divorce process before you hire the lawyer. The more you know about the process, the less of a need you're going to have to ask your attorney everything. We've got a book for that too. It's the Florida Divorce Law Guide and Control Your Difficult Divorce. Free links in the description are also available at divorceinformationbooks.com. Tip number three, for minimizing your legal fees, keep your communications with your lawyer concise and related to the legal issues in your case. The lawyer is there to convey status updates and give legal recommendations based on the facts that they get from you. They can give you answers to your questions, they can give you a legal strategy, but where you will drive up the legal fees though is when you spend time with them complaining about what the law is, complaining about how things aren't fair, or talking to them about things that they either can't fix or are not related to your case. And tip number four for reducing your divorce legal fees and costs is don't get divorced. Take the time before you go through the divorce process to make sure it's truly necessary. Yes, there are relationships that cannot or should not be fixed. If there's violence, abuse, emotional abuse, you probably shouldn't stay married. But there's a lot of people that don't fall into that boat. So take the time to work with a couples counselor if you're not in one of those toxic relationships to see if you can save the marriage. For more information on that, check out the description for a link to staymarriedflorida.com. It's got a lot of videos, podcast interviews, and links to therapists in the Florida area. If you're watching this from outside of Florida and you need a therapist recommendation, let us know. We will try to find one for you. So some additional resources here. Check out the description. We have links to our attorney fee and cost article on our website. All of the books that we're mentioning, the staymarriedflorida.com website. Take the time to learn more. This will reduce what you spend on your lawyer. If you're at the point of needing to talk to an attorney about a divorce case, you're welcome to contact my law firm, and one of my law partners will have a consultation with you. They will walk you through a strategy for your case, answer all of your questions, and leave you in a spot to where you can approach divorce with confidence. There's a lot of myths out there. One of my partners can debunk those myths for you, and more importantly, give you a plan that you can follow. We're located in South Florida. Most of our cases are in the area from Vero Beach south to Miami. We work in a few other areas of the state on a case-by-case basis. As our firm grows, this could change in the future. Hope this has been helpful. Subscribe for more.